G'day, how you going? Hopefully you're having a good day or week or whatever it is since the last time I talked to you. Hope things are sort of moving forward for you or going in a direction that you'd like them to go. I talked a couple of videos back about sort of change, and I did want to sort of delve a little bit more into that. I have got some experience about being change. I was for a while a change agent, and they call. There's project management or project managers. Change agent is somebody who takes people through change and deals with all the fallout of that change as well. They're the fall guy. I've done that job a couple of times, and it's quite an interesting experience actually, because looking at how people deal with change is quite extraordinary. Just like in lots of other fields, there's no one or two ways that people deal with change. They all have their own little things that they need to do, to work through, and it's interesting how that process happens, because it's also quite different for people to do that. As a change agent, we always talked about timeframes. We talked about the emotional ride, the mental ride, and then also a little bit of that process of, as I've talked about once in grief, a similar sort of process happens through change as well. People go through that sort of nearly that grief process when they're in there. One, they don't want to. The first step is really that denial. Then the second step is really that bargaining. Then there can be the outright hostility where I'm just not going to do this. Then there's that sort of time frame where there's a little bit more of a acceptance of it, and then an acknowledgement and a working through of how that works. And that happens for most people. It's just the thing that happens is, what part of that journey do people hit and at what times? And which parts are more important, are more developed in certain people than others. So some people spend a lot of time in that first one where it's denial, like change. I don't need change to happen. I don't want it to happen. It's not something that I'm interested in. I don't want to change the way I'm doing. I'm happy the way I am. I don't see the need to do any changing. And that is normally where you have to do that engagement. And this, when we're talking about change, even for ourselves, this is where you also need to talk to yourself, understand. Sometimes it's about having a grief counsellor if you're going through grief and change. And I'm talking about that from my own personal experience from the loss of my father. But if you've got other sort of change that you're doing, you do have to sort of acknowledge that something else has stopped. Something is stopping, and something is changing to some new norm. And I think that's a lot of times what people don't sort of take the time to do, to realize that they're going from one situation, there's going to be some sort of step change, and they're going to be in another situation. And sometimes that grief and that hostility towards that change, it manifests in that sort of sense, because they're not wanting to accept that this change is going to happen. Then there's really that bargaining, and this is sometimes when you're even doing it yourself, when you're having some change that you need to do. Well, why should I? What's the benefit for me? It's always that. You're always talking about what is the benefit for yourself, and that is, that's common. You're always trying to sort of understand a little bit more about what will I get out of this? What will I benefit from this? And so sometimes that's more difficult to understand if you're not in the change, or the change has been directed by somebody else. But they're the sort of things that you do need to sort of sit down sometimes, and that's where things like simple as pros and cons and those sort of things come in, to sort of say, okay, well, how's this change going to be good for me? What things are going to be bad for me, or what things do I have to let go? And so those things are also then important to work through, so that you can start to do those sort of things and then become a little bit more au fait with that. And even when you're doing certain things, like if I use my father's example again, the bargaining that I had to go through is that I won't be able to tap him for knowledge, for experience and those sort of things. And I had to take another step in growing up and saying, okay, well, now I have to be a little bit more self-reliant, but also tap into different people. I know I don't want to, and I like going to my father because I understood how he worked. I understood what he stood for a lot of times and the things that he was about. But now I have to talk to other people about this, and that's, bargaining is about that. Well, how's that going to impact you? How's that going to be a good or a bad thing? And that sort of that bargaining step that you have to do, you have to sort of understand how that's going. First, it's about the denial of it, and sometimes that leads on into that because you might switch between the denial and the bargaining for a while because you may not come up with something that you are happy with. You might sort of be doing some bargaining, and you might sort of say, oh, well, I'll go, if I use my father's example again, I might sort of say, oh, well, I might go to my father-in-law or an uncle or somebody else. But if I don't have the same level of respect for them as I did for my father, then I'm not going to listen to them a little bit. So then I might hop back into denial again about the whole situation, and I don't want to be dealing with this. So there's that constant thing that you're going through there where you might be jumping backwards and forwards between that denial stage and then that bargaining stage. And I think it's important to recognize that you might sort of be hung up in that stage for quite some time. And it takes some time. And sometimes you might move directly through denial straight into bargaining because you're like, well, I know I can't change this. It's going to happen. So I'm going to start working out what I can do to make this easier for myself. And other times you might stay in denial for a long time because you just don't want this change, because this is going to have a huge amount of impact on you and you don't want to sort of deal with that. Maybe it's not the right time for you to deal with it. You have other things going on, whatever it happens to be. But sometimes you can say, and then that third stage is really, well, it's not maybe the third stage. There's probably other little stages all between that and stuff. But that third stage is around that acceptance where you sort of understand what that change actually means. What that change is actually going to give you. You've passed the denial, as it were. You've gone through the bargaining quite a few times, and you're now out the other end. You've gone through and you've tried to understand what it means, how it's going to affect you. You're also still trying to work out what the new norm will look like, and now you're at least accepting of the idea. And you're now trying to bed that idea down and sort of say, well, how's this change going to look? So, if I'm now suddenly going to use an uncle as a person that I'm going to refer to, or maybe as a peer instead, then how does that relationship now change? How does that look in a sort of different sort of way? And who will step into that role? And what happens if they leave? Because you've had this other relationship and that person left, not of their own free will, obviously, but they did. What will happen then? How are you going to deal with that? So there's still bargaining that's going on, but it's got an underlying of acceptance. You're now really just working out the odds and ends, the little finesses that you need to do so that you can sort of either move into this a little bit more full-bodied and know what you're doing, or if there's still some bargaining, you might go back to that bargaining and sort of tweak that a little bit with whoever it is. Sometimes when it's with yourself, you realize, okay, I'm not going to be I'm not going to be working with somebody else, but I've got to give myself a break. I've got to allow myself to make some mistakes. Whatever it happens to be, it's those things that you've got to then try and do. So when you're going through that change and you've gone through that denial, you've gone through that bargaining, and you then hit acceptance, there's still chances when you might sort of go through backwards and forwards. And even when you've gone down acceptance, there will be still times when you go back into denial and really sort of say, I don't want to actually do this. I just want what that state was before. And I think when it's in a grief process or something like that, you absolutely want to go back to where it was before, but you know that you really can't. In a work and another situation or a mental health sort of state where you've got to make a change, sometimes because that former state was so easy and you knew it so well, it's very easy to slip back into those states again. And so that's why sometimes when you hit that acceptance mode, and then you're trying to embrace that, that's where maybe the habits that you need to do are very important, because you need to create new habits for yourself so that you can actually do that change a little bit easier, so that you don't fall back into that and sort of know that you've got to go through this whole process again. So just because you've gone through denial and acceptance, and then you're hitting, and you've done your bargaining, and you're hitting that now implementation, as it were, of that change, or you're going to run with that change, you might jump back to all of those other things again, because the road might get rocky, the road might get hard, something untoward comes up that you hadn't expected, that might just knock you around. And so the only way to deal with that is what you still got internalized, which was pre-change, because okay, I can do this, I know how to do it through that. And so sometimes you'll actually be thrown back, and that's where you need to sort of, oh no, I'm supposed to be doing this way now, and I've got to move that, I've got to move forward in that sort of sense. So sometimes that there'll be testing points along the way of that process where the change will sort of, well, not the change won't be doing anything, it's not a living, breathing of it, but the change that you're trying to implement will try and kick you back to where you were. And your mind will say, yeah, why aren't we doing it like this? This is much easier. This is much simpler to do it back here. We knew what we were doing here. We were much safer. We were fine, and everything was going on all right. So you're always going to be sort of pulled back to that original stage. So that's why sometimes small habits, small changes, implementation at a smaller level first, and then build upon that is actually the way to embed some of that change in a little bit easier way. Some of the things then can become a lot simpler to do at that point in time as well. So there's just a few techniques there, and just a few things to sort of think about when you're going through change, because it is something that we all go through, and it is also something that can take an age to do. Like some changes are very easy. You move house, well, you can't go back to the old one because there's somebody new living in there. So the change might be traumatic right at that point in time, but there's no going back. That's one of those burn your bridges sort of things where you can't go backwards anymore, because there's only way forwards. And then there's some changes which are a little bit more mental, sometimes physical. Diets is another one that people talk about. I want to change my body shape, my body image, and they talk about those sort of things. And that can be a little bit difficult. But I think the thing that you've got to realize is that you can't do change in one day. And anytime you fall off the bike, as it were, in the change of bike, just get back on and keep pedaling. Don't berate yourself. Don't make yourself feel guilty for not being able to see it through. It's just saying, it's just a hiccup. I'll get back on. I'll do it right the next time. So it's all of those things are starting to sort of wrap together to sort of say, okay, from a point of view of change, it's not about feeling guilty when I get it wrong one time, when I make a mishap. It's about saying, okay, I made a mishap. It's acknowledging it, saying it happened. Okay, let's do it the right way, the way we're supposed to, the change that we want to make, and keep on going with that at that point in time. So when you're going through that process of change, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the background that you just need to be aware of, and you need to give yourself a break when you're doing it. And sometimes you will fall off, as it were, fall off the wagon, fall off the bike, whatever metaphor or saying you want. But the most important thing is to get back on and try it again tomorrow. We're always going to have a bit of a struggle here and there, and sometimes we just need to get back on and keep on going. Anyway, hopefully that was interesting. That's just some of the stuff that I learned as a change manager, and also through some of my own processes that I've been going through lately. So hopefully that was of interest. Thank you for spending the time with me. I know this one was a little bit longer than normal, so I do thank you for staying tuned and listening to, and hopefully that was of interest. Anyway, look after yourself, take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you another time.